Now we turn to our panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to this. We've got two very dynamic people who will be taking the lead on this. As I introduce you, please come up and take your seat on stage, and we'll take it away. I'm delighted that also traveling with us from Pittsburgh is Kannan Srinivasan. Kannan is the first Rohit Tolani Distinguished Professor of International Business. That's as in Rohit Tolani, our alumnus and co-host, who gave the money to make this chair possible. Not that chair, but the endowed chair. Kannan is an expert in marketing and management science, bringing highly sophisticated analytical and quantitative methods to marketing. He's particularly well known for working at the intersection of marketing and operations. Lately, he's been very active in internet marketing and with a particular focus on auction-related companies. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Srinivasan. Please come. We're very informal here. You can have a seat. Our other panelist is Sam Tsien. Sam is Senior Executive Vice President and Head of the Global Corporate Bank of Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation, or better known as OCBC. Sam is also the parent of a sophomore in Humanities and Social Sciences, which is how we've gotten to know him and why we get him to Pittsburgh from time to time. In his role as Senior EVP, Sam is head of all global corporate and commercial customer relationships and handles all corporate clients here in Singapore, in Malaysia, and in many other overseas branches. Sam also serves as director of Singapore Island Bank Limited, OCBC Bank China Limited, and as president commissioner of PT Bank OCBC Indonesia. I'm very glad that Sam agreed to be with us today, and we found him here in Singapore. Sam Tsien. All right, so we're going to start by my asking our panelists some individual questions and get them talking. We'll do this for a few minutes and then pretty quickly turn it over to you. So please be thinking about the questions you'd like to ask Kannan or Sam. And Kannan, let's start with you. As we all know, we've heard a lot about, and probably Tom Friedman popularized it more than anybody, the new global economy, or not so new anymore, but the global economy is very much a product of new technology, and particularly information and communication technologies made possible by that. And as I mentioned in my introduction of you, marketing and the internet is something you've been particularly active in. One of the questions that occurs in that sort of sphere is what kind of problems do you see for internet marketers, especially working between countries where so much of it is global anyhow, and what trends do you see in that?
All right. Let me kind of tell you a little bit about some of the research work I do in this area so that you know where I'm coming from. As you can imagine, the internet generates an enormous amount of data, and one of the things that I have been working on is how do you leverage data to make sense out of this? One of the very early things that I did, it's about 7 or 8 years ago, which is basically to look at if consumers are clicking on actual data, can we say something, one of the big challenges most companies face is people actually surf most of the time and exit, right? And not everybody buys. It's very different than the regular retail environment. If you're going to Carrefour or Walmart, 80% of the people don't come in and not buy anything. They end up buying something. So one of the very early models that we worked on was, can I look at the pattern of data in which you're clicking? From that, can I assign dynamic probabilities? It turns out to be a little bit of an advanced methodology called hidden Markov models. But the basic thing that we were able to predict out of that was, if I see 6 of your clicks, we will be able to predict with a very high probability, 90% accuracy, whether you're going to surf the web and exit, or whether you're going to actually buy. So that's an interesting thing, right? We actually did it with Barnes& Noble. Amazon was really interested at some point in time, because how do we convert some of those people who come in to surf the web and convert them into actual buyers? Now, an interesting story in this is, you slowly, at some point in time, you don't think, when you're clicking through this, somebody can tell you this. So there's also some very interesting privacy issues. A second set of research work we did with one of my colleagues is that actually we can profile you by looking at the set of sites that you've been visiting. We can figure out what your age is, what your income is, what your gender is, education level, and that makes some people very uncomfortable. So, we do this with it's a two-edged sword. At one level, as researchers, we tell you what the power of what the data can tell you. We also, at another level, we are also kind of exposing you to say that you might be thinking, when somebody says, ask this information, I'm not providing this information. It's no longer necessary. We can kind of track what you're doing, and we can start profiling you. So, an interesting area where I think, when I kind of look at the international issues, the notion of what we think about privacy differs across countries, right? I originally come from India. Quote unquote, Indians value privacy to a lesser extent than what Europeans and Americans might value privacy. So that both opens up opportunity, that also closes opportunity for you, right? So that's one area where I see that there is going to be huge difference across countries in terms of what they can leverage and what they cannot leverage. The second thing where I think that an interesting divergence that's emerging between various countries is in the area of mobile versus internet. In a country like India, and to a lesser extent perhaps in China, it is the mobile phone that will drive the internet usage. Mobile phone is still the preferred medium of communication. Text messaging is the most prevalent way in which they do things. In fact, actually, there's a Silicon Valley funded company aggressively in India focused on text message-based marketing, not internet-based marketing. So a lot of thin clients, so the mobile, because the mobile market is several times bigger than the internet market. Okay, so for those of you who are looking for opportunities across countries, I think that's a tremendous divergence between US and India, US and China. Mobile phone is still a very powerful, effective way of communicating. So this company actually, every month, sends out 3 billion marketing text messages. Right? And so almost accounts for 10% of all the text messages that happen in India. So those are some of the very interesting differences that you would see across these countries.
That's very good. It raises a lot of questions, but I'm going to hold my tongue and hope that others will ask. Let me turn to Sam for a minute and come back to you later. Here's a tough question, but it sort of has to be asked. In America, at least, bankers have come in for a lot of criticism over the last couple of years, being blamed for the recession in America, at least, with a particular focus on overly risky investments or risky lending practices, et cetera. And one thing that's called for in America, at least, is new regulations, maybe even a new regulatory body. Your impression of sort of what the global scene is with regard to banking and risk-taking, and whether you see a global, like, super regulatory authority emerging would be interesting and very timely.
This is a popular question.
Yeah.
It's a sensitive question. It's controversial. I work for the banking industry, but I try to be as unbiased as possible. First of all, I think this recent events that led to the recent financial crisis, the pursuit of risky loans, is pursued in an environment which is very conducive for these sort of things to happen. One of the things that we see was there's extreme amount of liquidity in the market. Interest rates was extremely low. And one other thing which is not frequently talked about, which is an observation I would like to share with you, is that there is quite a bit of concentration of funds in fewer hands. If you look at 20 years ago, most of the people will put their money in the bank, in the savings account, in the time deposit account. But over the past 20 years, the development of private equity funds, of mutual funds, of hedge funds, have resulted in these funds gradually rotating into fewer hands. These institutions, fund managers, they try to pursue for additional incremental profit because they want to compete with each other in order to deliver a better return for their investors. And I think this has contributed to the institutions trying to find riskier but more profitable products for their investors. So that is a phenomenon which I believe contributed to the creation of exotic products, leveraged products, which then created a compounded problem in a market where the liquidity is abundant and people has got the greed to continue to pursue for these profits. So then what is it that we could do about it? President Cohon mentioned about, is it a good thing to have a super regulatory body to coordinate all of the world efforts? I think in a way it's already being done. First of all, in getting the countries out of this financial crisis, all of the central banks in the world, for the first time, have worked together to come up with arrangements and subsidies and rescues that try to contain this problem. Secondly, there is already an institution called Bank of International Settlement, which in a way is the central bank of central banks. Try to put together new measures to make sure that the banks and other financial institutions, if they were to face the similar situations in the future, will not create this sort of a financial turmoil. And they do this in a fairly traditional way. In December of last year, they have announced a series of measures which they try to address the capital problem and the liquidity problem that the market faced. One of them, the measures that they have introduced is try to make sure that during the good times, the bank needs to keep more capital. During the bad times, the bank will be able to utilize those capitals accumulated during the good times to support them during the bad times. They call it pro-cyclicality approaches. Another measure which they try to introduce is to redefine what is called capital of a bank. As we lend money, the most important thing that we can ultimately rely on is, first of all, capital, and secondly, liquidity. So on the capital side, currently a lot of instruments are captured into the capital, such as, in addition to what we normally know, paid up capital plus retained earnings, you have preferred shares, you've got subordinated debts, and then you've got hybrids. Now there is a move, try to reduce the components of capital to fewer instruments, maybe only to paid up capital and retained earnings. All these perpetuals, hybrids, convertibles, preferreds will no longer be counted. So the quality of the capital is being increased right now. Another measure that is being done is create some control over how much expansion that the bank can have. As you may have noted, recently in the U.S., the president has announced to have Paul Volcker relook at whether commercial banks should be able to utilize depositor money to go into leveraged transactions, which are the areas that investment banks used to do. So they try to do a lot of these controls. I think ultimately what these measures will achieve is it is going to suppress the activities of the banks for a while, and then after that, the pursuit of return, the pursuit of profit is going to return to the banking industry, and it will move gradually away from what we were able to achieve for a short while as a result of these measures. Some of these activities that were engaged by the bank in pursuit of profit, with hindsight, we can say it does not really create economic value for the society. So maybe going forward, we should use that principle. It's difficult to reduce that to rules, to the principle that banks should really be allowed to pursue activities that create economic value. And then with that principle, we try to work through what are the rules that we can introduce to direct the banks towards those activities. We don't know whether it's successful or not, but perhaps following this principle, this sort of events that we have seen over the past 2 years, will not be repeated.
Thank you, Sam. I want to go back on the one thing. You referred to an organization as the
Bank of
Banks
International
Banks.
Settlement.
Yeah. Is that an independent thing, or is it part of an international organization? Does it come out of the IMF? Or?
No, it is an international organization called the Bank of International Settlement, and the member of this organization are all of the central banks around the world. And they do meet annually to talk about what are the issues that the financial market are faced. And in this crisis, they have a task force specifically formed to see what improvements can they make, particularly in the area of liquidity and capital, so that this sort of crisis, systemic risk, could be reduced.
Very interesting. And I guess that also says there was probably more coordination among the banks than we might have thought.
Yes.
During the crisis.
Yes, particularly during this crisis. It was not seen, as you may know, President Cohon, that during the late 90s to early 2000, there was this Asian financial crisis.
Right.
During that time, there was some coordination amongst the Asian banks, but there was no coordination amongst the global banks.
So let me throw out another topic. We're kind of dabbling around here, and then we'll pursue some more fully when the audience starts asking questions. You can't talk about a global anything without talking about India and China, and especially sitting here in Singapore. I'd be interested in your observations about India and China, the relationship to each other, but especially how Singapore sees itself relating to India and China in the banking industry, or more generally. And I know Singapore as a nation and Singapore institutions are keenly aware of Singapore's role in the world, and always reminded of how small Singapore is compared to giants, especially like China and India. So one question I imagine for Singaporean companies especially is being competitive with the giants like the banking industry of Shanghai or banking in Mumbai or whatever. So your thoughts about India, China, the relationship to each other, the relationship to Singapore, whatever you'd like to say, and that would be valuable and interesting. Who would like to go first?
Okay. Singapore is sometimes called the red dot because it is just a little red dot on the world map. So we're very small. Singapore is engaging both China and India to pursue for business opportunities. And those business opportunities are both inward bound and outbound. In terms of outbound, Singapore is doing quite a bit of things to encourage Singapore companies to move offshore, to create activities for the Singapore companies, because the domestic market here is just so restricting, so small, that they are not able to continue to grow without an external market. And Singapore is therefore encouraging the companies to go into China. Same thing about India, but I guess because of the cultural relationship of the people, the Singapore companies are engaging China more than that of Singapore. At least this is based on my observation of the client base that we have in Singapore. On the other hand, we are also inviting companies from China and from India to come into Singapore to do things such as fundraising, treasury type of activities, as well as create businesses which are less labor intensive, such as testing centers, things like that. I think these are the things that is being done. But on the other hand, Singapore is not only engaging China and India, Singapore can really only survive by serving as many countries as possible. So the ASEAN nations is another important region that Singapore is working on. So suffice it to say that I think the push for Singapore to move out, to create activities for the Singapore companies, and also to attract investments to come in here to do the activities that Singapore is good at, has been very, very strong.
So just running back one before Kannan jumps in. The Singaporean population is about, was it 60 or 70% ethnic Chinese?
Yeah, it's about, yes.
And about
a majority,
10%
a majority of
Indians.
that is Chinese, yes.
Yeah.
10%.
Indian is about 10%. is that
10%.
right? Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Kannan.
No. Just wanted to add a few things to that. I think Singapore is, making certain very good decisions. Number one is focusing on education. There's tremendous need for higher education in this region, particularly countries like India. The demand for higher education, in my mind, is going to grow exponentially over the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, part of the reason why we should be here and why we are here, I think, is a good thing for us. I think that's a very important value add intellectual capital intensive business that will serve them very well long term. In terms of the financial markets, from whatever little I know, I think there's a significant competition between Shanghai, Mumbai, and Singapore. Still, both China and India have to go significant ways in terms of creating transparencies in their market. While they're getting better at this all the time, there is still a certain amount of reluctance for international pension funds and so on and so forth to invest directly into venture capital firms into India, or private equity firms into India. And I think if you do that in Singapore, there's a greater degree of reliance on the fact that the Singaporeans will do much stronger due diligence. I think there's a stronger notion of corporate governance that they can leverage, and I think that will be a significant add-on. Third area where I think Singapore could benefit and would be an interesting way in which for them to contribute would be, Singapore has been closer to has a far greater understanding of the US markets. An area where there is a significant shortage of capital still in India and China. I know some of the private equity firms in India, and I think it's true of China as well, as the early stage funding is not very aggressive in these countries. So there's a tremendous dearth of capital at the very early stages, and they don't, because they see that as extremely risky, and these countries still haven't really established themselves as the innovative centers like a Silicon Valley and so on and so forth. So most of the time you would see there's a significant amount of funding that's available for late stage companies and not for early stage companies. And I think Singapore still, because of its understanding of these markets, could be a significant player in terms of early stage companies. And the fourth level in which I would say here and stop here would be in terms of Singapore and Malaysia, for example, are the first in terms of raising the sovereign capital, very significant amounts, Temasek and Khazanah in Malaysia. And actually, if you benchmark it as a percentage of their GNP, it's very substantial in terms of how they have put their own government pension funds into these sovereign funds and have really leveraged that and utilized that, right? And I think that's still a very significant area of advantage for these countries, because I still think India particularly runs a significant deficit, so they don't have a significant amount of dollars to put into private equity funds. And the last one, which I think, particularly looking at India, is that for those of you who had been there recently, I think with India is the huge contrast in IT and physical infrastructure. It's a country that is contributing globally on the IT infrastructure, has a really backward physical infrastructure, and everybody recognizes anywhere upwards of $500 billion to $1 trillion is required in India. And Singapore has done this very well and is in a position to really participate in that phase of Indian economy that will probably go on for the next 10, 15 years.
One of the points I wish to underscore is the point that Professor made, that is about the international knowledge that Singapore has. And this is very, very important. this applies not only to companies, but if you look at the government of Singapore, they're very international. They know what's happening in the world, and they want to make sure that the advantages that Singapore has, the legal system, the corporate governance, the transparencies, the discipline, we will promote it as much so that we can bring this to an overseas market and use it as a competitive advantage and bring the companies to invest into Singapore or otherwise use Singapore as the funding market for their overseas activities. On the other hand, Singapore government also uses its own international knowledge to invest their reserve into the international businesses to continue to create value of the funds that the country has created. So that international knowledge is very important. And in this context, President Cohon, when you mentioned about the internationalization of CMU, it is something that we really need to promote. It is something that Singapore really has made the best use of, and if we can sort of continue to work towards that direction, with your university programs introduced, I think it would just reinforce our position.
I certainly agree with your observation about how international Singapore is. We certainly see that in the higher education sector. All of your 3 universities are linked to many, many universities in other countries. And
Yes.
they made a point of doing that
Yes.
from the very beginning. They're very conscious about that. And without question, it has served the nation very well.
Yes.
So let me invite your questions about any topics. We've just sort of touched on a few things, but we've got 2 excellent, thoughtful people here. Be happy to respond to anything you might have on your minds. Don't be shy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Min, alumni from 2003. First, a clarification. Temasek does not manage pension funds in Singapore. So, just want to make that clear.
I stand corrected. My apologies.
Yeah, so Temasek actually manages funds on an independent basis. The government needed Temasek some time ago. And Temasek runs on a commercial basis. So that's the basis of us using bonds of the Emperor of Temasek by the name.
But it's a lot of money, that we know.
Oh yes, it's a lot of money. Yeah, but my question really is, you see India and China growing very, very fast, but do you see a potential glitch in that? Are there any asset bubbles that we should be concerned about? And in the longer term, maybe the 10, 20-year term, would you see a major correction in any of the 2 countries?
Maybe I'll take China. I think there are economic excesses in the country as a result of this fast growth. So there's a certain element of misallocation of resources. However, I do not think China will end up in a hard landing. We have to recognize that China is still a centrally planned economy. The government has got a lot of mechanisms built in the system to direct the resources to appropriate areas. And they have a lot of experience as well. The first cycle that they experienced was in the 1980s, of which they did not handle very well. And after that, it was sort of a hard landing, which resulted in a slow growth for China, correction of past economic excesses for about 5 to 6 years. But the cycle that happened in the 90s, the cycle that happened in the early 2000s, they have handled it very, very well. During this time, over the past 2 years, when the global economy was facing a lot of challenges, the Chinese government directed its economy to creating domestic demand. And as a result of the surge in domestic demand, despite the fall in exports, the country continues to be very stable and continue to grow at a very respectable rate. So I think it is true that there are economic excesses that has created, but I believe that the government of China will be able to control those excesses in such a way that will not result in an economy ended up in the hard landing.
They've started to put the brakes on a bit lately, haven't they?
Yes. What they did is that in the early part of last year, which is January of last year, they recognized what's happening in the market in the world where export is going to significantly shrink. They immediately opened up the financial system to request the local banks there to lend. And that created a lot of economic activities, which also resulted in consumer demand increases. And towards the end of last year, they saw that the world economy has stabilized and the local economy is overheated. They then introduced quite a number of measures. Administrative measures, including imposing quotas onto the local banks as to how much you can lend, and policy matters, including raising what we call the required reserve ratio, the 3 Rs, so that the amount of money that the banks can lend would be restricted as well. So through a combination of both monetary policy as well as administrative measures, they're able to quickly adjust the economy.
So responding to your question, I completely agree with whatever that has been said before. The only interesting thing is that, first of all, it's very impressive. I mean, any one of us who goes to China, what it has accomplished in the last 15 years is absolutely stunning, right? And the social metrics are also very good. There is no other society in the history of humankind that has brought up so many people from below poverty line to above poverty line compared to what China has achieved in the last 15 years. So that's absolutely remarkable. I think it's always a cautionary signal, cautionary tale from Japan. For a while, Japan seemed like a country that seemed to know how to manage everything very well, and the government was very actively involved. And so you always worry about, so for the academics, in some sense, it's a natural experiment. There's a natural experiment that's going on between India and China. China is a very strong, resourceful government that's trying to drive the growth. In India, oftentimes people would say, in spite of the government, still the country is growing. So we see Indians, businessmen actually see an impediment. So in some sense, you kind of look at it, you know, in some sense, we will know the answer in 10, 15 years as to which one of the model is actually better. And I think the Chinese government is very sober, and I think they've also learned the lessons from the Japanese. So I think the key thing is, if there are asset bubbles, are they able to deflate it slowly and effectively and start deflating it much before it settles in? Okay. The last point I want to make on that is, whenever we think about this, you know, it's just a 120-year history where the other economies, the European and the Western economies, have been bigger than these two countries. If you kind of go back into 1850s and 1860s, India and China accounted for 2/3 of the global GNP. So it should not surprise us that they could come back and regain that status in another 20 years or 30 years or so.
Yes.
Innovative financial products, for example, credit default swap. Do you think that's a potentially stabilized force for
So just to repeat the question, the role of
credit default
credit
or
default
in general innovative financial products that are untested for bankers, investment bankers, may introduce them to the market and then everybody takes them out and without proper analysis of risks involved in them. Do you think these things are responsible for financial chaos?
So the role of credit default swaps and
Yeah.
other exotic instruments. Let me just say that before Sam responds to this, that as the pioneer of computational finance, Carnegie Mellon is very sensitive to questions like this. It's very same people, right? But as Steve Shreve, the math professor who is the leader of the computational finance program, said to me, Jerry, when bridges fall down, no one calls for the abolishment of the civil engineering profession. In fact, they say, well, we need more and better civil engineers. So that's his way of saying we need more computational finance experts. Sam, this is a very big and important question.
Yes, the academic purpose of these derivative products was to remove volatility from the financial market, and also to render protection where direct protection is not possible. Credit default swaps were created such that if you are investing in a particular country, and if that country faces the political risk, how do you insure against it? So people will come up with credit default swaps so that you lost money in one end, you get money from the other end. What had happened, I think it was then built into what is generally called structured products, where the original purpose of these products were lost. And then people created additional products by leveraging the derivative products that was created in order to get the return that they want. After this crisis, it was known that a number of pitfalls have been identified. First of all, as these products evolve, the understanding of these products over time, as these products are continued to build, becomes less and less. So people are investing into these products without truly understanding what implications it does have. Secondly, I think sometimes we say that there must be a policeman of these things, and we go back to regulators. But do the regulators understand the amount of risk that was created by these companies who invest in these products? Regulators, I think, have also lagged behind in terms of their understanding of these products, partly because maybe these products are just so sophisticated and regulators are just trying to play the catch-up game. But I also try to bring up another point which may be controversial in a way, because after the 9/11 incident, regulators spent a lot of effort on what is called counter-terrorist financing. It's one type of anti-money laundering, but anti-terrorist financing. And we were very concerned, the industry was very concerned that perhaps there were money being channeled through the system to move into areas which are terrorist related. So worldwide, regulators have been focusing on those particular areas. And as a result of that, the attention that was paid to product innovation, perhaps, now nobody can prove this, perhaps has been reduced. Plus the fact that the fast development of these products was difficult for anybody to truly understand what's really happening. Plus the leverage, plus the greed, all these things combined together. And during the initial period, they do get the return that the investors want. So the investors put more money into it, and the vicious cycle just got started. I think this is what happened. What we need to do now is to again go back to the basics. What is the economic value for the creation of this product? And if it has gone beyond the economic value, then I think that's the time where we collectively, as a market participant, as the regulators, as the central banks, which should try to look at. But I would not say that it was created by these innovative products. These innovative products were created for a purpose, and those purpose continues to be valid.
Very quickly, my thought on this is, I think the biggest challenge is that the more complex the product becomes, it's becoming very hard to actually assess the risk of this. And I think that's it became so opaque at some point in time. Actually, I had an accounting colleague who basically mentioned, he said that he has no idea as to how any of the accounting firm certifies any of the audited financial statement, because there is no way they can understand the risk that entails a lot of these things. So he says that you might think we have got audited financials, but nobody understands the risk level of these complex products. If you want to be a little skeptical, I would always say one of the things, and that's going to make it really hard to regulate it as well, is there's always a market for sophisticated products. And there's an interesting article I actually read in The Economist, which is interesting. About 40 years ago, 50 years ago, only the 5% of the top class, 5% of the top of the class actually went into finance and investment banking, right? Now something like 30 to 40% of those people go on there. And when you kind of see the potential opportunities, career opportunities for them, and then you kind of look at India and China producing all these smart people, if they get into it, there is always a tendency to kind of create a next sophisticated instrument. And second thing is, I think the behavioral aspects, finance, I think, as an area in my mind, has ignored the behavioral aspects. It's humans who make decisions. There's a very interesting, for those of you who's interested in looking into that story, it's too short for me to, this time period is too short for me to describe it. There's a wonderful piece on public television on long-term capital management. And ultimately, if you go back and look into long-term capital management, the biggest mistakes were made by people who emotionally make decisions, even though they develop the product saying that it's people's emotions that prevent them from achieving higher returns. So the whole product was supposed to be unemotional, but when the product doesn't work the way it's supposed to, it's humans who just to say that now I'm going to change that, I'm going to modify that. So I think finance as an area is beginning to understand the behavioral aspects. It's humans who make decisions. The third thing is I'm someone who looks at data to a large extent. Sometimes I'm always skeptical whether we will ever understand the risk until the event has happened. After 9/11, it seems like so obvious somebody will take a big plane and blow it into, ram that into a big building and cause the collapse, that it would seem so easy that someone should have seen that as a very easy way of creating chaos. So we have very few data points. Even though we have got financial crisis, it's very few data points. So unless you have a lot of data, it's very hard to uncover the underlying risk as well, which also complicates the problem.
I can't help adding two observations. One is the whole area of decision-making under risk, of course, is a very well-developed, especially in business, but it's used in my field of water resource systems management also. Well-developed, but on the other hand, it's remarkable how we kind of lose the ability to go back and put ourselves in the position of the person making the decision in the face of uncertainty when they made it. It's sort of like black swans are so obvious after you see one, But imagining a black swan before one has ever shown up is extremely hard. And so this goes back to human behavior. The other thing is simple-minded, coming from just a simple civil engineer, not a financial expert. The rating agencies on this whole thing seem to have gotten off awfully easy. They seem really to have dropped the ball. And at least in America, they were barely, they've been totally left alone, it seems. Gotten a clean bill. And it's surprising.
Reference agencies should really be used as a reference. And therefore, from that perspective, I don't think we can put too much blame on them, because it's up to you whether you want to refer to them or not. So the institutions and the investors themselves should truly understand. But using reference agencies' rating as a reference only. Yeah.
Keep that in mind. Carnegie Mellon's bonds are AA minus, and you can take that to the bank.
Can I add something very quickly on that? I just want to give a plug for Carnegie Mellon. That's one of on the frontiers of the behavioral decision theorists. Some of the smartest people that we know are at Carnegie Mellon, and they're beginning to work much closely with the business people in terms of understanding the humans making risky decisions. Second thing I personally wondered, kind of going back to your rating agency issue, is the fundamental conflict of interest issue, right? It's on one hand, you kind of give the rating, on the second hand, you're getting so much of business from them. This would seem like a perfect spot for someone like Singapore to step up, because as a government, as a kind of place that's known for making careful decisions independent of all those conflicts of interest, and create a rating agency in Singapore which does only rating and does not do any other business with them. Right? I thought that would be some kind of a model that kind of takes it away from all the places where this mess has happened, and shifting it to some of these places would be an interesting opportunity.
You heard it here first. Other questions? Okay, let me wrap up with one more for you guys. It's the ultimate softball. Kannan made reference to it in his last remarks, and that's the role of higher education. It's a softball, but also self-interest. Self-interest in this. Singapore is known justifiably for making very large investments in higher education. The 3 universities, which have been very successful on the world stage, even SMU, which is only 10 years old, is already establishing itself. The 4th university that they're creating. The amounts of money that the Singapore government has invested in people to send abroad to study and come back. It's all very well known, and from abroad, it seems like it's had big impact. So I think we all agree with that. I guess the question here, the softball, is what can other countries learn from this? In India, you made reference to it before, Kannan, in China or elsewhere. Any observations or thoughts about this? Or go ahead, Kannan.
I think from an academic perspective, particularly Jerry as a president of the university where you have to keep faculty happy and retain them, China, like everywhere, like everything else, seem to have a very coherent policy in this. In the last few years, it has been very aggressive in terms of building exceptional, outstanding science universities, right? And with its huge resources, it has allocated those resources and has bought out some of the best and brightest faculty across the world and brought them to China. And they've started to do that in business. So about 5-7 years ago, business school faculty in China would make about half the salary that they would make in the US. But now the top faculty in the business school can command 20-30% higher salary. And when you adjust for cost of living, that's almost like 2 times or 2.5 times. It's a good thing that Mandarin is still not the international language yet, and so that still keeps some of the faculty from going there. I think India has its own set of very good universities, and actually and that's what I really like about Singapore. Singapore was trying to get, some of you might know, the Indian Institute of Technology is one of the remarkably strong academic institutions. It's harder to get into than Stanford or MIT or Harvard, any of those universities. It's extremely
Even Carnegie Mellon.
It's extremely competitive to get into. And actually, Singapore was very much interested in opening up, getting IIT to open up a campus in Singapore. As much as I like India, I think one of the areas which is kind of holding India back, and I think there's no easy solution, there are some important social implications because we have a long history of different castes and having different level of success in the country, and in a democratic process you want it to be much more representative. So I think they impose significant hard quotas, and I think that has kind of prevented a lot of top universities from going into India. And I think if India finds a way to, and that's again plays into the strength of Singapore. I think one of the things that you looked at it, and which always impresses me as a person of Indian origin to come in here, that how coherently Singapore is such a wonderful cosmopolitan place. And one of the things that always impresses me is that if you kind of go to these areas like Serangoon or something like that, there are people who will wear the kind of dresses, ethnic dresses from India, that's not even common in the bigger cities anymore. But they will be very comfortable in wearing it in Singapore, and they can move around in Singapore. Nobody is staring at them. You are not, and so I think it's a wonderful thing. And I think that's a hard thing for other countries to replicate. They need to replicate that before they can get higher education of the international standards.
Yeah.
Yeah, Professor, I do not have a lot of things to add, but I think China is investing quite a bit into the education side. They adopt the same elite system type of education as Singapore is adopting. Perhaps China should do more, is to open up a bit more accepting in differences in terms of fields, as well as solicit multiple sources of opinion in grooming their education going forward.
Very good. Let me just, in closing, observe a couple of things, picking up on these last comments. I loved Kannan's observation, not only about Singapore's commitment to higher education, but also its wonderful diversity and tolerance. I think you're absolutely right. I think anybody from anywhere would feel comfortable in Singapore. And that's exactly the kind of campus we've been working to create in Pittsburgh and everywhere else Carnegie Mellon does business. We recognize that this is absolutely key, that making progress in the world today means being diverse, taking advantage of all the diverse perspectives that people from different walks of life, different geographies, different backgrounds can bring to solving a problem. That's why we've worked so hard to create the diverse university we have, and why we've committed ourselves so much to being an international university, which is such a key part of that diversity. So in a lot of ways, Carnegie Mellon and Singapore think alike in terms of what we try to be and in what Singapore has succeeded in being. We're very proud to be a partner of so many Singapore institutions, a strong collaborator with the Singapore government, and delighted by our strong alumni base here. As you heard mentioned at the outset, and I repeated it, this is our largest gathering of alumni in Singapore. We couldn't be more pleased. We're very proud of you, and we thank you very much for your participation. Please join me in thanking again Professor Srinivasan and Mr. Tsien.